strange historians. Strange historians.
You are choking on your own bile, clutching your stomach as another wave of agony tears through your bowels like molten iron. The stone walls of Newark Castle blur before your eyes as sweat pours down your face, mixing with tears you cannot control. Your crown, that golden symbol of absolute power, sits forgotten on a wooden table, its jewels catching the flickering candlelight while you writhe in a bed soaked with your own filth. The smell is unbearable. Your courtiers have retreated to the far corners of the chamber, covering their noses with silk cloths, their faces masks of barely concealed disgust. You are King John of England, and you are dying in the most undignified way imaginable. Your royal bowels exploding with such violence that the very foundations of your kingdom seem to tremble with each spasm of pain. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The year is 1216 AD, and England bleeds from civil war. Outside these castle walls, French soldiers under Prince Louis ravage the countryside, while rebel barons celebrate what they believe will be your imminent demise. They do not know that your death will not bring them victory, only a 9-year-old boy named Henry, who will rise to become one of England's greatest kings. But in this moment, as you convulse with another bout of dysentery so severe that medieval chroniclers will struggle to find words polite enough to describe it, you are simply a man facing the most grotesque death imaginable. Your journey to this putrid deathbed began 3 days earlier in the marshes of the Wash, where your greed and paranoia cost you more than just treasure. They cost you everything. The cold October wind whips through the narrow windows as another spasm grips you, and you remember the moment when the muddy waters swallowed your baggage train whole, taking with it not just golden jewels, but your last hope of paying the mercenaries who might have saved your throne. But death comes slowly, and memory comes in waves between the pain. As you lie there, alternately burning with fever and shivering with chills, the full weight of your catastrophic reign presses down upon you like a stone tomb. You are not just dying, you are dying as the most hated king in English history, and the manner of your death will become a source of dark satisfaction for your enemies for centuries to come. The irony is exquisite in its cruelty. You who starved children to death, who ordered the wives and daughters of nobles brought to your bed, who murdered your own nephew with your bare hands, you now die like a peasant afflicted with the flux, your royal dignity dissolved in rivers of bloody excrement. The very intestines that once digested the finest foods in Christendom now turn against you with the fury of every injustice you have committed. Your physician, Master Peter, hovers at a safe distance, his face pale with helplessness. Medieval medicine offers no cure for what afflicts you. He has tried bloodletting, which only weakened you further. He has given you herbs and tinctures that made the cramping worse. Now he simply watches as the most powerful man in England is reduced to something less than human by the rebellion of his own bowels. Between spasms, when the pain recedes just enough to think, you recall the events that brought you here. Memory comes in fragments, each one a fresh torment added to the physical agony coursing through your abdomen. It began, as all your troubles did, with Magna Carta, cursed document sealed at Runnymede on June 15, 1215 AD, when your own Barons forced you at sword point to limit your royal power. You had smiled and signed, your hands steady, even as your heart burned with rage. But the ink was barely dry before you began plotting revenge. Within 10 weeks, you had convinced Pope Innocent III to declare the charter shameful and demeaning, illegal and unjust, and null and void of all validity forever. The civil war that followed was swift and brutal. Your barons, desperate and divided, made the ultimate betrayal. They invited Prince Louis of France to cross the Channel and take your throne by May 1216 AD. French soldiers were marching through the English countryside, and Louis himself was being hailed as the rightful king in London. Half your kingdom was in rebellion, the other half in flames. You fought back with characteristic viciousness. Where Louis showed mercy, you showed only cruelty. When you retook the town of Worcester, you ordered every rebel hanged from the battlements until the ravens grew fat on English flesh. At Rochester, you had prisoners catapulted over the castle walls. Your mercenaries, paid in silver looted from monasteries, left a trail of burned villages and violated women across the countryside. But cruelty, you discovered, has its limits. Money does not. By autumn 1216 AD, your treasury was nearly empty. The French had superior numbers and the support of half your nobility. Your own supporters began to waver, their loyalty measured against the weight of their purses. You needed one decisive victory, one grand gesture that would turn the tide of war in your favor. The answer lay in East Anglia, where your sheriffs had been collecting taxes with ruthless efficiency. The villages of Norfolk and Suffolk had been bled dry. To fund your war, their grain stores emptied, their cattle driven away in endless trains. If you could consolidate these resources and strike at the French supply lines, you might yet salvage your throne. On October 9th, 1216 AD, you rode into King's Lynn like a conquering hero. The merchants and burgesses greeted you with forced smiles and opened purses, pressing gifts of gold and silver into your eager hands. For one glorious day, it seemed as though fortune might yet smile upon the most notorious king in Christendom. That night, you feasted in the hall of Bishop's Lynn, as the town was then known. The table groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and flagons of wine. You ate with the appetite of a man who had been campaigning for months, tearing into fowl and venison with your hands, washing it down with goblet after goblet of rich Gascon wine. Your courtiers watched nervously as you consumed enough food for 3 men, but none dared suggest moderation to their volatile king. Unknown to you, the seeds of your destruction were already taking root in your belly. The town's water supply, contaminated by the season's heavy rains and the presence of thousands of soldiers, carried within it the microscopic agents that would soon transform your intestines into a battlefield. Medieval physicians understood nothing of bacteria or contamination. They blamed illness on bad air or divine judgment. In your case, they would prove half right. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind blowing in from the north. See, your advisors urged caution. The route north to Lincolnshire was treacherous, especially the crossing of the Wash. But you were impatient, driven by the desperate energy of a man who knew his time was running out. The French were closing in from the south, and every day of delay meant more defections among your remaining supporters. You made a fateful decision that morning, one that would echo through history. Rather than take the longer, safer route around the Wash, you chose to split your forces. You would ride north with a small escort, covering ground quickly, while your baggage train laden with all your portable wealth would take the more direct, but perilous route across the mudflats and tidal channels that separated Norfolk from Lincolnshire. This baggage train was no ordinary collection of supplies. It represented the accumulated plunder of your entire reign, concentrated into a few dozen wagons for rapid transport. There were the crown jewels, including the magnificent German crown that had belonged to your grandmother, Empress Matilda. There were chests filled with gold coins bearing your own stern profile, silver cups looted from abbeys, jeweled clasps stripped from the necks of defeated enemies. Most precious of all were the regalia of royal power, to complete sets of ceremonial items that legitimized your rule. Swords blessed by archbishops, scepters carved from ancient ivory, rings set with gems that caught fire in candlelight. These were not mere decorations, but talismans of kingship itself, symbols that transformed a murderous younger son into an anointed ruler. The plan seemed sound enough. The baggage train, guided by local men who knew the tides, would cross at low water when the sands were firm and the channels shallow. Meanwhile, you would ride the long way around, spending the night at Wisbech before joining the main road north. By evening, both parts of your force would reunite in Lincolnshire, your wealth intact and your strategic position restored. Roger of Wendover, the chronicler who would record your final days with such vivid detail, later wrote that the Wash was a river which is called Wellstream. In truth, it was far more dangerous than any river, vast estuary where multiple waterways converged, creating a maze of channels, quicksands, and mudflats that shifted with every tide. Even experienced guides sometimes lost their way, and the penalty for error was drowning in the sucking mud that could swallow a horse and rider in minutes. Your baggage train set out from King's Lynn in the early morning of October 12, 1216 AD. The wagons, heavy with treasure, moved slowly across the firmer ground near the town. But as they approached the edge of the Wash proper, the going became treacherous. The wheels of the cart sank deep into soft earth that became progressively wetter and more unstable. What happened next has been debated by historians for 8 centuries, but the essential facts are clear. Somewhere in the middle of that grey expanse of water and mud, disaster struck. Whether through miscalculation of the tides, poor guidance, or simple misfortune, the baggage train became trapped as the waters began to rise. Wendover's account, written within living memory of the event, describes the horror with stark precision. The ground was opened in the midst of the waves, and bottomless whirlpools which swallowed them all up with the men and the horses, so that not one foot soldier escaped to announce the disaster to the king. Picture the scene: dozens of wagons laden with the wealth of a kingdom, their wheels mired in quicksand as the tide rushes in with the speed of a galloping horse. Men shout warnings that are lost in the wind. Horses rear and plunge as they feel the ground giving way beneath them. The drivers, realizing their peril too late, abandon their charges and try to flee on foot, only to find themselves sinking deeper with every step. The king's treasure gold cups that had graced the tables of Norman kings, jeweled swords that had hung at the belts of Plantagenet princes, crowns that had rested on royal heads for generations, of it disappears beneath the muddy waters in a matter of minutes. The very symbols of your authority, the physical manifestations of your divine right to rule, are swallowed by the Wash completely, as if they had never existed. You, meanwhile, rode on in ignorance. The first you knew of the disaster was when evening came and your baggage train failed to appear at the appointed meeting place. As the hours passed and no word came, a cold dread began to settle in your stomach, a different kind of sickness from the one that would soon consume you. When survivors finally straggled in with news of the catastrophe, you received it like a blow to the chest. The chroniclers record that you fell into such grief of mind on account of the things swallowed up by the waves that you were seized with sharp fevers and began to be grievously sick. Whether the shock alone was enough to trigger your illness, or whether the dysentery was already incubating in your system from contaminated food or water consumed in King's Lynn, the psychological impact was devastating. You had lost more than treasure. You had lost the means to continue the war. Without gold to pay your mercenaries, without regalia to legitimize your authority, without the accumulated wealth of your reign to buy loyalty, you were just another defeated warrior in a land full of them. The French prince who claimed your throne suddenly seemed far less like a pretender and far more like an inevitability. That night, October 12, 1216 AD, you took shelter at Swineshead Abbey in Lincolnshire. The Cistercian monks received you with the weary courtesy due to a king, even one whose reputation for cruelty preceded him like the stench of carrion. They provided their finest chamber, their best food, their most attentive service, but they could not provide what you needed most, a way to undo the disaster that had befallen you in the washed-out sleep. When it came at all, brought no peace. You, tossed on your bed, alternately burning with fever and shivering with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. Your stomach, already unsettled by shock and stress, began to rebel in earnest. The first cramps were mild, easily mistaken for indigestion from the rich meal the monks had provided. But as the night wore on, they intensified into something far more sinister. By dawn, you could barely stand. The fever had worsened, and your bowels had begun the violent rebellion that would define your final days. The monks, alarmed by your condition, suggested rest and spiritual comfort. But you were a king at war, and rest was a luxury you could not afford. Against all advice, you insisted on continuing north toward Newark, where you hoped to rally your remaining supporters for one last desperate gamble, the ride to Newark Castle on October 13th was a nightmare of pain and humiliation. Every jolt of your horse sent fresh spasms through your abdomen. You rode hunched over, one hand pressed to your stomach, the other gripping the reins with white knuckles. Your courtiers, riding at a respectful distance, exchanged worried glances as they watched their king deteriorate before their eyes. By the time you reached Newark, you were barely conscious. The castle servants carried you to the finest chamber, but no luxury could disguise the fact that you were dying. The dysentery had taken hold with a vengeance, turning your intestines into a source of constant agony. Medieval chroniclers, writing for audiences unaccustomed to graphic medical details, struggled to describe your condition in terms that would not offend delicate sensibilities. Roger of Wendover blamed your illness on pernicious gluttony, claiming that you had made yourself sick by gorging on peaches and new cider at Swineshead Abbey. This explanation, while medically inaccurate, served a moral purpose. It portrayed your suffering as divine judgment for a lifetime of excess and cruelty. The reality was likely more mundane dysentery, contracted from contaminated food or water, possibly in King's Lynn, and exacerbated by the shock of losing your treasure. But regardless of the cause, the effect was unmistakable. You were dying. In the most undignified manner possible, your royal dignity stripped away by the basic rebellion of human biology. The king who had ordered others tortured and starved was now experiencing his own form of exquisite torment, one that no amount of royal authority could command to cease. The chamber at Newark Castle became a theatre of medieval medicine's futility. Master Peter and his assistants tried every remedy known to their craft. They bled you repeatedly, believing that removing the corrupt humors would restore balance to your system. They administered potions made from herbs whose names are lost to history. They burned aromatic woods to purify the air, hung talismans around your neck, and muttered prayers over your writhing form. Nothing worked. If anything, the bloodletting weakened you further, while the herbal concoctions triggered fresh bouts of cramping and diarrhea. Your attendants, forced to clean up after each explosive episode, began to look upon you with barely concealed disgust. The man who had commanded absolute obedience from earls and archbishops now inspired only revulsion in servants, who had to handle his befouled bedding. During the brief interludes when the pain subsided enough to think clearly, you tried to conduct the business of kingship. Letters were dictated to scribes who held cloths over their noses. Orders were given to commanders who stood as far from your bed as courtesy allowed. You attempted to rally your remaining supporters with words of defiance and promises of victory, but your voice, weakened by fever and dehydration, carried little conviction. The irony of your situation was not lost on you during those lucid moments. You, who had spent a lifetime accumulating power, who had murdered and betrayed your way to absolute authority, were now powerless to control the simplest functions of your own body, the intestines that had once digested the finest foods in Europe, now expelled everything with violent rejection, as if your very flesh had joined the rebellion against your rule. News of your condition spread quickly beyond the castle walls. In London, Prince Louis received reports with barely concealed satisfaction. The French prince, who had spent months besieging Dover Castle while you ravaged the countryside, saw opportunity in your illness. If you died without recovering your strength, the war would effectively end with his victory. Your supporters, already wavering, would have little choice but to accept French rule rather than face continued bloodshed for a lost cause. But your enemy's celebration was premature. Even as you lay dying, forces beyond the chamber were already moving to preserve the Plantagenet dynasty. Your 9-year-old son, Henry, safely guarded at Corfe Castle in Dorset, represented hope for those who preferred an English king, even a child to a French conqueror. The boy's guardians, led by the formidable William Marshal, were already making plans for a swift coronation should the worst occur. Your loyal supporters began arriving at Newark as word of your illness spread. These were hard men who had profited from your reign and feared French retribution should Louis triumph. They came not out of love. Few could claim to love King John, but, from calculation, a dying king might yet recover. But a French usurper would certainly remember those who had opposed him. Among the visitors was Nicola de la Haye, the remarkable woman who held Lincoln Castle for you against overwhelming odds. She arrived to find you barely conscious, your face gaunt with fever and pain, but even in your extremity you recognized her worth. In one of your final acts as king, you formally appointed her Sheriff of Lincolnshire, making her perhaps the only woman in England to hold such authority. It was a gesture that spoke to your desperation and perhaps to a belated recognition of competence over gender in matters of life and death. The Abbot of Croxton was summoned to provide spiritual comfort as your condition worsened. This elderly Cistercian, accustomed to the final confessions of lesser mortals, found himself faced with cataloguing the sins of one of history's most notorious rulers. The confession, conducted in whispered Latin while you drifted in and out of consciousness, must have been an extraordinary ordeal for both participants. What sins did you confess in those final hours? The murder of your nephew Arthur, the young Duke of Brittany whose claim to the throne had threatened your succession. The starvation of Matilda de Braose and her son William, locked in Corfe Castle and left to die for your twisted pleasure. The countless acts of rape, murder, and theft that had characterized your 18-year reign. Or perhaps simpler, more human failings, the fear that had driven you to cruelty, the insecurity that had made you suspicious of every ally, the desperate hunger for approval that had manifested as tyranny. The chroniclers, writing for audiences that demanded moral instruction, from historical narrative, portrayed your final confession as sincere repentance. But they were not present in that chamber, breathing the foul air thick with incense and human waste, watching a king reduced to something barely recognizable as human. More likely, your confession was the rambling of a fever-broken mind, mixing genuine remorse with delirium and desperate bargaining with a god you had spent a lifetime defying. October 17th brought no relief from your suffering. If anything, the dysentery seemed to intensify, as if your body was determined to expel every trace of the life it had sustained for 49 years. The fever peaked and broke repeatedly, leaving you alternately drenched in sweat and shaking with chills that no fire could warm. Food became impossible. Even water triggered fresh spasms of agony. Your physician, Master Peter, had exhausted his repertoire of treatments. Medieval medicine, with its reliance on bloodletting and herbal remedies, was helpless against severe dysentery. In an age when the causes of disease were attributed to divine displeasure or an imbalance of bodily humors, there was no understanding of bacterial infection or dehydration. You were dying of what modern medicine could cure with antibiotics and intravenous fluids, but such knowledge lay centuries in the future. The pain had become constant now, a grinding agony that offered no respite. Your bowels, inflamed and ulcerated, expelled blood along with whatever meager contents remained. The royal chamber, despite the best efforts of servants armed with herbs and incense, reeked of human waste and approaching death. Courtiers, who had once competed for your attention, now found excuses to conduct business elsewhere, leaving you attended by only the most loyal or most desperate of your followers. During the long night of October 17th to 18th, consciousness came and went like tides in the wash. In your delirium, you relived moments from your catastrophic reign, the weight of the crown on your head during your coronation at Westminster Abbey in 1199, the satisfying crack of bone when you struck down Arthur with your own hands, the screams of women and children as your mercenaries sacked rebel towns, the cold satisfaction of watching enemies grovel for mercy they would not receive. But mixed with these memories of violence came stranger visions. You saw yourself as a young prince, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, desperate for approval from a father who seemed to prefer your older brothers. You remembered the nickname Lachlan, John without territory, John without inheritance, John who would have to make his own way in a world that had already been divided among his siblings. Perhaps it was this early sense of dispossession that had driven you to such extremes of acquisition. Having started with nothing, you had spent your adult life accumulating everything: lands, titles, treasure, power over life and death. But now, as your body prepared to abandon the struggle, all of it was slipping away like sand through your fingers. Dawn on October 18th, 1216 AD, brought a brief rally. The fever broke temporarily, and you regained enough strength to speak coherently. Sensing that time was running short, you summoned your remaining courtiers for what would prove to be your final royal act. With witnesses present, you dictated your last will and testament, a document that would survive the centuries as the oldest extant royal will in English history. The will itself was surprisingly conventional, dividing your personal possessions among your children and making provisions for prayers for your soul. But more significant was your choice of executors. 13 men led by Gwala Bikri, the papal legate who had supported you throughout the Civil War. By entrusting your legacy to the church rather than to secular lords, you were making one final gesture of defiance toward the barons who had forced Magna Carta upon you. You also addressed the question of your burial, a matter of particular significance. In an age when the location of a king's tomb could become a pilgrimage site or a symbol of political legitimacy. Originally, you had planned to be interred at Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire, the Cistercian monastery you had founded as penance for the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket, crime committed by your father, but one for which your entire family bore responsibility. But Beaulieu lay in territory controlled by rebel barons, making burial there impossible. Instead, you chose Worcester Cathedral, where you had once prayed before the tomb of Saint Wulfstan, the last Anglo-Saxon bishop. When asked about this decision, you reportedly said, "To God and Saint Wulfstan, I commend my body and soul." It was perhaps the only humble statement recorded from your entire reign, a final acknowledgement that even kings must surrender to powers greater than themselves. As the day wore on, your condition deteriorated rapidly. The brief morning rally gave way to renewed agony as the dysentery resumed its violent course. Your pulse, already weakened by days of fever and dehydration, became increasingly irregular. The royal chamber, which had witnessed the final moments of many lesser nobles, prepared to host the death of a king. Outside Newark Castle, a thunderstorm was building. The October sky darkened with heavy clouds that seemed to press down upon the earth like a physical weight. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the narrow windows. Medieval minds, attuned to omens and portents, would later interpret the storm as heaven's commentary on your impending death. Your breathing became labored as afternoon faded into evening. Each inhalation was a conscious effort. Each exhalation might be the last. The assembled courtiers, those few who had remained loyal to the end, began to recite prayers for the dying, their voices mixing with the sound of rain against stone and the distant rumble of thunder. The papal legate, Gwala Bikri, administered the last rites with solemn ceremony. The host was placed upon your tongue, Ronick, since your inflamed digestive system could no longer process the simplest food. Holy oil was applied to your forehead, your hands, your feet, marking you as one prepared for the journey beyond death. The rituals that transformed a dying sinner into a departing soul were performed with all the dignity that your royal status demanded, even as your body continued its revolt against authority of any kind. As night fell on October 18th, 1216 AD, the storm outside reached its full fury. Rain lashed the castle walls, and thunder shook the very foundations of Newark. Inside the royal chamber, by the flickering light of candles that seemed to dance, with each gust of wind, you fought your final battle not against French invaders or rebel barons, but against the simple, inexorable fact of human mortality. Your last coherent words, preserved by the chroniclers who would memorialize your reign, were a plea for divine mercy. God and Saint Wulfstan, receive my soul. They were the words of a man who, having spent his life defying earthly authority, finally acknowledged a power that could not be bribed, threatened, or murdered into submission. the end. When it came, was neither peaceful nor dignified. Your body, racked by days of dysentery and fever, simply gave up the struggle. The violent spasms that had defined your final days continued even after consciousness faded, as if your intestines were determined to have the final word in your rebellion-torn life. The king who had controlled the fate of millions died unable to control the simplest functions of his own flesh. The exact moment of death is disputed by the chroniclers, just as they disagreed about so many details of your reign. Some placed it on October 17th, others on October 18th or 19th, but the date mattered less than the manner. King John of England, destroyer of the Angevin Empire, oppressor of his own people, had died of explosive diarrhea while a thunderstorm raged overhead and French soldiers celebrated in the lands he had lost. Your body, still warm but already beginning the process of decay that claims all flesh, was prepared for burial with ceremonies that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances of your death. Royal robes were placed over limbs that had voided themselves repeatedly in the final hours. A crown was set upon a head that had been bathed in feverish sweat. The symbols of kingship were arranged around a corpse that bore little resemblance to the feared tyrant who had once made England tremble. The journey to Worcester Cathedral was a funeral procession through a kingdom at war. Your coffin, escorted by those few nobles who remained loyal, traveled through countryside where French soldiers and English rebels competed for control. Villages that had suffered under your rule watched the cortege pass with emotions ranging from relief to satisfaction, to simple indifference. The king who had demanded absolute obedience was now powerless to command even respect from those who observed his final journey. At Worcester, you were interred with all the ceremony due to an anointed monarch, regardless of how that monarch had lived or died. The cathedral that would house your tomb for centuries to come received your remains with the same solemnity it would have shown for a saint. The inscription carved into your tomb, written by some unknown poet, managed to find dignity in even your ignoble end. In this tomb lies the image of a king who in dying brought much peace to the world. There is fear that evil fates may follow after death. For those who read this, fearing death, reflect on what the end of days may bring to you. But even in death, you could not escape controversy. Within decades, stories began to circulate that you had not died of natural causes at all, but had been poisoned by a monk of Swineshead Abbey. The tale, almost certainly false, speaks to the lasting hatred your reign had inspired. People preferred to believe in assassination rather than accept that their tormentor had simply succumbed to a common disease. The truth was both more mundane and more terrible than poison. You had died of dysentery, a condition that claimed thousands of medieval lives annually, but was particularly cruel when it struck in your circumstances, weakened by stress, poor sanitation, and the rigors of campaigning. Your body had fallen victim to a bacterial infection that modern medicine could have cured easily, but that medieval physicians could only watch helplessly as it ran its course. Your death changed the course of English history in ways that your life never could. Within days, your 9-year-old son Henry was crowned king at Gloucester, beginning a reign that would last 56 years and see England emerge as a major European power. The French invasion collapsed as English nobles, faced with the choice between a foreign conqueror and an English child, chose the familiarity of Plantagenet rule over the uncertainty of foreign domination. William Marshal, the greatest knight of his age, became regent for the young king and proved far more capable of governing than you had ever been. The revised Magna Carta, issued in Henry III's name, became the foundation of constitutional monarchy, rather than the temporary expedient you had intended. The very document you had tried to destroy became your most lasting legacy, though not in the way you would have wished. But perhaps the most fitting legacy of your reign was the manner of your death itself. In an age when kings were expected to die gloriously in battle or peacefully in their beds, you managed to achieve neither. Instead, you died of explosive diarrhea, your royal dignity dissolved in rivers of bloody waste. Your absolute power rendered meaningless by the rebellion of your own intestines, the chroniclers of your era, writing for audiences that expected moral instruction from historical narrative, portrayed your death as divine judgment. They saw in your dysentery a fitting punishment for a life of excess and cruelty, of cosmic justice that reduced the mightiest to the most base. Modern historians, less concerned with moral instruction, might see instead a more subtle form of poetic justice. The man who had spent his life causing suffering finally experiencing ultimate suffering himself. Your tomb at Worcester Cathedral, opened in 1797 to verify its contents, revealed that you stood 5 feet 6.5 inches tall, slightly below average for your era, but not unusually so. The skeleton, examined by local surgeons, showed no signs of the violence that had characterized your life. Death, it seemed, had been the great equalizer, reducing the tyrant to the same collection of bones and dust that awaited every human being. But even in the grave, you could not escape the consequences of your reign. Unlike the tombs of other medieval kings, which became pilgrimage sites and symbols of national identity, yours inspired no particular veneration. Visitors to Worcester Cathedral might pause to read the inscription and recall the stories of bad King John, but few came seeking miracles or spiritual intercession from a king whose life had been so thoroughly devoted to temporal rather than eternal concerns. The treasure you lost in the wash was never recovered. Despite centuries of searching and numerous claims of discovery, the crown jewels, the golden cups, the jeweled swords that had symbolized your authority, all of it remains, buried somewhere beneath the shifting sands and mudflats of that treacherous estuary. Perhaps it is fitting that the symbols of your earthly power should lie hidden beneath waters that ebb and flow with tides you could never control, in a place where even kings must yield to forces greater than themselves. In the end, the manner of your death became as much a part of your legend as any of your living acts. Kings might be remembered for great victories or noble sacrifices, but you are remembered for dying of explosive diarrhea while your kingdom fell apart around you. It is a legacy that no amount of royal ceremony or historical revision can obscure, the ultimate demonstration that even absolute power has its limits, and that the human body recognizes no crown or scepter when it finally decides to rebel. The thunderstorm that raged over Newark Castle on the night of your death eventually passed, leaving behind a kingdom forever changed by your absence. Your son would prove a far better king than you had ever been. Your enemies would find victory less satisfying than they had imagined, and your legacy would be defined not by conquest or glory, but by the humiliating circumstances of your final days. And so ends the story of King John of England, who lost an empire, signed away his absolute power, died of explosive diarrhea, and inadvertently gave birth to constitutional monarchy through the sheer incompetence of his tyranny. In the annals of royal deaths, few have been more and none have carried such consequences for the future of a nation. You rest now in Worcester Cathedral, where the carved stone bears witness to a reign that proved once and for all that even kings must answer to powers they cannot bribe, threaten, or murder into submission. inexorable rebellion of their own mortal flesh.